Hello and welcome today. So let's today talk about the engine cooling system. So how does the engine cooling system work? First, we have to understand that we have two types of cooling systems. That is, one, we have the liquid cooling system, and then the other we have the air cooling system. So with the air cooling system, what does it mean? It means that this kind of cooling system, we don't have the coolant involved in the cooling system. But with the liquid cooling system, we have the coolant running through the engine. An example of air cooling system, we have the motorbikes, these small engines that don't require the radiator in cooling the engine. But with the vehicles, you'll find that we have to employ the liquid of the coolant so that we can cool down the excess heat that is produced when the engine is running. So we came across a client who has an issue with the engine overheating. First thing to understand is that engine heating is not bad, but we have an issue with its overheating. Now, why do we say that engine heating is not bad? It's not bad because as the engine runs, the piston moves up and down, and in the process, friction is involved. And what happens when friction is involved? When two objects rub against each other, heat is produced, and in the process, that engine or the engine head or the engine itself gets heated up. Remember, for engine to function properly, it has to heat up to an optimum temperature, an operational temperature. So it's important to understand that when the engine is cold, it has to warm up first before you can start driving through for optimum performance. Now, what causes engine overheating? Remember, engine overheating is a point whereby the engine goes above, the heat goes above the normal temperature. That is, when your gauge, when you look at the dashboard, that gauge is way up above the half. Let's say this is the gauge. Let's say this is the gauge. So this gauge over here goes way up to the red mark. Goes way up to the red mark, meaning that it has exceeded the normal operating temperature and it's blowing up. So what causes that? For us to understand how that comes up, we have to know what exactly happens in the engine cooling system. Now, the components of the engine cooling system are as below. So first we have the water pump, we have the temperature sensor, we have the coolant, we have the radiator, we have the radiator cap, we have the cooler fan, the cooling fans, we have the thermostat, then we have the head gasket. So what role does each of them play in maintaining a steady operational temperature? If we take, for instance, the temperature sensor, as the word suggests, it gives a signal to the fans what the temperature the engine is running at. So you'll notice that before this temperature reaches to the operation temperature to which the fan should open, the coolant inside just flows, goes to and fro the engine block. It does not go through the radiator. It does not, the thermostat does not allow it to go through the radiator and come back. So you notice that at cold start, before the engine gets warmed up, the coolant will just flow to the engine block, up the cylinder head, then back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, without going to other areas, or rather the radiator. Now, what happens when this thermostat fails to work, or what happens when the engine gets heated up after all that time. Let's say the engine has started from cold, you've put the switch on and the coolant is flowing smoothly. The purpose of this thermostat is to open up so that when the engine is already hot, this coolant should flow over to the radiator. So this radiator here, its purpose is to cool down or to radiate the excess heat from the engine. So this thermostat opens up, then the coolant flows into the radiator. Remember that we have the fans over here. So when the temperature is reached at point of which these fans should be open, this sensor sends a signal to the fans to open so that the coolant that flows in goes to the radiator, cooled down, then taken back to the engine, and the cycle continues. So overheating comes in when this thermostat fails to open. So when this thermostat fails to open, what happens? When it fails to open, this coolant won't go up. It won't go up to the radiator. So what will happen? This coolant will just be flowing through the block and the head, through the block and the head, through the block and the head, without going to the radiator so that it can be cooled by the fan. So in the process, you'll notice that the temperature will go so high than the normal. So it will have to, the gauge will go so higher than the normal, and that's when you'll find that the engine is starting to overheat. And the second reason for having an overheating in an engine is the failure of the water pump. Now imagine this water pump has failed, or this pump has failed to work. Definitely this fluid will not be flowing. So it means whatever fluid that we'll be having in the line will just remain there. Now what happens? When this engine is operating, temperatures will rise. And whatever happens, when it rises, whatever fluid that is in the system will have to boil up. Now as it boils up, there is no way you can release this heat to the atmosphere. So how do you achieve that? You only release this heat to the atmosphere when the fans are involved and the radiator releases the heat to the atmosphere. What's another reason for an engine overheat? Well, a failed temperature sensor. Remember, this sensor is linked directly to the fans, to the electric fan, that is. Though there are other fans that are not connected, they are just belted up. But with this, since they are connected to the fan, it's only that this signal will be sent to this fan to open so that the coolant can be cooled down. Failure to this sensor over here could lead to overheating. Why? Because the engine will just be heating up and not being cooled, since the fans are not operational, are not open. Another reason for engine overheat: low coolant level. So low coolant level also, it's very obvious. Maybe when you don't have enough to fill in these all areas, so the engine will start to heat up, and in the process, when it heats up, it will start to evaporate. Now when this amount of fluid evaporates, you'll notice that the coolant drops down and down, and that in the process will have to raise the temperature of the engine. You've done with that. Then clogged radiator fins. Yes, remember that the cold currents that are coming from the atmosphere, they have to go and reach the coolant inside here. Now suppose you've blocked here, maybe let's say this avenue over here is blocked. So it means that this heat that is in the line, that is in the radiator, will not escape out to the atmosphere. So in the process, the same amount of liquid that is heated up will just be flowing back and forth without being cooled down in the currents in the atmosphere. Then another one is the faulty radiator cap. So faulty radiator cap, how can it cause overheating? Yes, it can cause overheating because remember this, the entire thing should be a vacuum. A vacuum should be created in this line. Now, faulty radiator cap, remember this cap is a valve. Now this valve should be opening when you have excess pressure. Remember, when this cycle keeps on running to and forth, in the end, pressure is created. So when you heat a liquid, or when you heat air, it expands. Now when air expands, it has to escape. So you have to find a way of escaping this air. So this radiator is a valve. Now this valve will only open when you have enough pressure over here. Now what happens, this coolant that is running through the system will have to expand, to open up and go to the expansion bottle. Just a minute. This is an expansion bottle. So when we have it at the expansion bottle, what happens? That amount of heated coolant is directed to the expansion bottle. Now, when the engine is cooled, when you've run for some time, then you cool down. This amount of coolant that has been sent over the expansion bottle will have to be drawn back. It will be drawn back by suction. It will be drawn back by suction back to the system when the engine cools down. So a vacuum, high atmospheric pressure will act into this expansion bottle, then it will force the coolant down, then the coolant will go back to the low atmospheric pressure area, that is the engine. Another reason for engine overheating, we are done with the fan failure. So this fan, if they don't open, remember the heated engine, the heated coolant will have to just go back and forth without being cooled. So it's important to make the coolant work. The fans work. Again, if you have a head gasket that is faulty, what will happen? Remember, this head gasket, when it's faulty, the amount of coolant that will be lost along this avenue over here. Remember, this is an engine block. Now it's a block like this. It has to be cooled down because it heats up. Now the work of this gasket, remember, in between we have the water jackets. So when these water jackets, when the coolant goes through them, what happens? It should cool the block. So a worn head gasket means that some of these coolants will be, the coolant will be released to the atmosphere. So when it gets heated up, it evaporates. Now when it evaporates, the amount of heat is lost, or the amount of coolant is reduced. And in the process, what do we find? We find that instead of creating that vacuum within the line, vacuum is not created, and thus the temperature is increased, because now, since the vacuum is not available, the coolant that is being cooled over here, the heat cannot be maintained in the system. Now, there's this part over here, the car interior heating system. This is when it's a cold start and maybe the environment is cold and you want to heat up the vehicle. Now this coolant that has been heated up here in the system, when you put the AC on in of the car, this component here, now this coolant goes into this component, then hits this part over here, then comes back and the system continues. So what have we learned today? Yes, engine heating is good for proper operation, but then the problem comes in when it overheats. Now what are the causes of the engine overheating? Here are some of the causes. Now we'll have to go and see practically what happens and how do we rectify this. So we'll have to go through this and find out what really caused this engine to overheat. Then after then we'll come back and explain exactly what we found.